I want to thank our sponsor, Planet Ford. Planet Ford has always been a proud supporter of law enforcement in the community, providing customer service and fleet management, sales, and service. If you're looking for that personal quality service, contact Planet Ford in Spring or online at planetford.com. You're listening to Crime Scene Today, where we talk about current issues facing law enforcement, forensic, and crime scene investigations. Today, I'm joined with my co-hosts, Leslie McCauley and Cele Rossi. All right, so we'll actually start off with a sort of crazy news story came out on April 4th out of Utah, with 2 children were hospitalized in Utah after eating THC candy from a food bank. So 11-year-old, 5-year-old were taken to the hospital Friday night after consuming medicated nerd ropes. Apparently, it was given to the church and the Utah Food Bank. Was distributed in 60 bags containing 3 to 4 servings. The labels of the candy indicated that each one contained 400 milligrams of THC. Adults are normally prescribed 15 to 45 milligrams. So yeah, that's happening. So
lovely.
Utah's not a legal state, right?
I don't think so. I wouldn't think so.
I wouldn't think so under Utah. So
they will be the last state ever to legalize.
I mean, that's sort of what I was saying. Well, either way, they're handing out highly potent nerd ropes to families at the food bank there. So that made the news this week.
Wow.
So on forensic advice, it's I guess a forensic question answer type of deal on Facebook. There's a question camp I thought was pretty interesting. Thought we'd sort of take it on without mentioning name of who asked, but I think it's actually pretty common. So I'll read this. It says that he needs some advice that so I have my BS in forensic science. I loved everything about forensic from a young age. I did a couple of internships, one resulting in employment as a death investigator at a coroner's office. Long story short, I don't like death investigations and left. My experience has caused me some questions about whether or not I actually if I'm cut out for this. I'm going to therapy, got diagnosed with PTSD, and am improving. I wanted to see if anyone else maybe had a similar experience, or if people in a career field think it's worth my time to try again, or should I head another direction? Does anyone have suggestions on something in forensics that maybe does not deal so heavily with deaths? I think that specifically what caused my distress, and what kind of specific schooling training needed for that position.
Wow.
So, I think there's 2 things that sort of get touched on there, and when I read that, it sort of reminded me of a story of we had some cadets from, I can't remember which police academy, but we were at the Forensic Center, and I was taking photos that day. And so the cadet sort of confided me and said, their interest when all was said and done, what they really wanted to get into was forensic photography. And I was sort of explaining to them that in doing this for a while, I don't know of any place that's just forensic photography. Matter of fact, I only knew of one place, which is in Harris County at the Forensic Center where they do autopsies, that there's a person that's all they do is photograph autopsies. That's the only truly what I know of as a forensic photographer, like by title, that's all you do. Every other CSI I know does everything, right? You do, fingerprints and sketching and video and photos and the whole thing, right? So that was the only, I guess, area that I knew that would happen. Well, as this autopsy is going on, I see that the person is slowly like backing away, and backing away. And not even halfway through, they are so far against the wall that if they could have pushed through the wall to get further away from the body,
they would have.
It would have, right? And I sort of say, you're going to have to get closer to take a photo. Right. And you just see the realization that they were not going to do what they initially thought they were going to do. Right. And that's sort of what came to mind when I was reading this and listening to this, that, and I do know, I mean, there's certainly a difference between being a death investigator assigned to the coroner's office. And I don't know a lot of the details of it. I don't know if this is a big one where you're just an investigator or if you're also on the body car and you're doing the investigation. It's usually something separate from being a crime scene.
Right.
But, I don't know of any, at least responding to a crime scene that you're not going to deal with death, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think that you would have to start looking at, depending on what coursework she had or he had in the, in college, then maybe that would qualify for like a lab position where you could do extractions or something like that.
Well, I know with like getting a master's degree or to do like DNA and toxicology, and correct me if y'all know different, but that normally you got to be like the master degree level, right?
Sure. Yes. But there are other lab positions that I think with a bachelor's, in a science degree, that you could be a firearms examiner with a Bachelor of Science. And I know that you had mentioned that it was in forensic science, but if it was a forensic science that had a strong science curriculum, then that's going to qualify you for a lot more than, maybe
criminal justice.
Yep.
Right. And I mean, one thing that comes to mind, and, Les, you can probably speak on this as far as fingerprint examiner at a lab.
Yeah.
What is sort of the entry level of a fingerprint examiner that they're looking at? And I'm speaking about like that's all they do all day. I know that there's some that there are some places that's what they employ, right?
Right. So as far as the tasks, you mean? The job duties, or
no? What kind of requirements? I guess if you're going to switch to that type of field.
Well, for us, I mean, it was a lot of extensive on the job training, but we did have formal training here in Texas. We all have gone under the structure of a basic, intermediate, and advanced training course. All of those are 40-hour week courses. So those three. And then we branched out into palm print analysis, which is another, I think it's a 3-day course. And then we just kind of built on it from there. And now when it comes to fingerprints, depending on the availability of what agency or entity this person would be looking at, you could have people who are strictly lab-based that are processing and developing fingerprints, documenting and comparing and identifying fingerprints, and typically never see scene work. Then there are agencies who have fingerprint-based people, technicians, but they are also scene responsive. So if there is a murder and there's a patent print, a print that's located in blood, that technician their sole responsibility might be developing those patent prints that are available or developing latent prints while another investigator handles the scene documentation. So there's a lot that's, I think, available, or a lot of different avenues. It really probably comes down to the area that person is living in, whether he or she is willing to relocate, to what extent they want to go into. And that's probably, I think fingerprints is just one example. There's other forensic disciplines that might have a similar kind of setup where they're not necessarily going to the death investigation scenes, but they're still able to be a lab technician in some aspect.
Now, I know in Austin, and it may be different now, I know in the past they actually had like their response teams divided. Like there was a response team that all they responded to were property crimes,
right,
and burglaries and those type of things. And then there was a totally separate team that would go to the major incidents like your murders and things like that. So, sort of like you said, I guess, depending on if you're willing to move, if you're willing to look into it, there may be some other options depending on how large of a department and how they run it.
Right. Absolutely. So, and it could also be an option of going back to college and pursuing a master's and going the lab route as far as toxicology, DNA, things like that. If like Shelley said, depending on their schooling background for their bachelor degree.
The second thing I want to touch on was her saying that she had I guess been diagnosed with PTSD over dealing with the deaths and those type of things, and Cele, we had actually touched on that last time we had talked. That's become more prevalent at the conferences, and my main point before even talking about it is just that she made the comment of. I don't know if she said, is it normal or do other people have this problem? And I think what we're starting to learn is that many people have had this problem. If we just haven't really been addressing it, right? So I know that that's come up at just about every conference is mental health and dispatch and patrol. And then you recently spoke about it being with crime scene investigators.
Well, and I just think that, maybe the reflection on that isn't that she was truly suffering from PTSD, but maybe, and I'm not trying to say that, or he or she, I'm not trying to say that they weren't, but when you think that no one else thinks about stuff like that, or no one else is bothered by the things that you see, maybe you think that it's just you. And so therefore, maybe you have PTSD because no one else is talking about how terrible this stuff is that we have to see. And, my recommendation for that would be that if, there was a counselor or a doctor that was helping that person through that period of time, that would be a question better suited for that professional to see if that is something that person should explore, if that's just going to be another episode, right? That it just stacks on top of what you've already had to deal with. So I just think that more and more we're seeing that people are not internalizing it as much. They are starting to vocalize that it's not normal for us to see what we see, and to be vigilant of our teammates that they don't then suffer.
Yeah, I think it's becoming a lot more normal for us to, it's always been normal for us to talk with one another. To talk about a scene or those type of things. And many times, we'll joke, and there's some dark humor and things like that we do to sort of just release that stress. But I think to make the comment of that scene bothered me is something sort of new to the conversation, right?
Sure.
That, this is keeping me up at night. I'm having, nightmares of this. I'm having thoughts of this. It's beyond the norm of the scene. And I think all of us have been there. If you've been doing this long enough that, we've all had that scene or even numerous scenes that have stuck with you longer. And you think about way after the fact and even currently. But I guess to a point, you also don't dismiss me. I've seen it in every aspect of law enforcement. Is there's people that really have a thought and a desire that this is what they want to do, but there's no way to tell someone what it is until they actually do it, right? You can go to the academy and you can go to FTO, and I think that's sort of the biggest realization is just from leaving the academy and going into the field with your FTO and learning, okay, sort of like had the foundation, now we're actually doing it. And then when that FTO leaves and you're the only one in that car and you're the first one to arrive to a scene, no one else is with you. And now comes the reality that, help is a radio away, help is coming. But for the most part, you're it, right? And there's a certain point that people realize they're not cut out for policing, and they're not cut out for crime scene. They're not cut out for whatever they chose. And sadly, sometimes it's further along in that process.
Right.
Well, the most disheartening thing that Leslie and I have talked about for what seems like 100 years, but is these kids that go to college and they're in their senior year and they're in their last semester and they want to come intern with us. And, they've gone to a decorated college and they are in, the lab for the first few days, and then the call comes in and it's summer and it's the Texas heat with the high humidity, and we go out to a scene, and everything that they read and everything that they studied and every, picture that they looked at, they were not prepared for it to be real life, and it's that realization, like, I can't do this, but I've just invested X amount of dollars at this university, and now what do I do because I can't do this?
Right. I mean, y'all have interns from very prestigious universities that are $30,000 a semester. And by the time they're getting to you, they're 4 years in, right?
Yep.
Right.
So, I mean, how many of them have actually, I guess, voiced that to you? I mean, how many have you like been on scene and they've actually verbally said, "I'm not going to be able to do this"?
We've had a
and that's really alarming. Oh, go ahead, Les.
Oh, I just said we've had a few over the years who maybe not have gotten to the point of saying, I can't do this, but we've had several who over the years who have said, have asked, can I come talk to you? And, I went to this scene or I went to that scene and I thought I would be okay with it, but I'm not sure. And, and just talking to them and finding out how they feel. What surprises me in the particular example that you read was that person stated that he or she went and did 2 internships. So I'm curious as to what type of internships they did, like in what aspect, what type of forensics did they encounter that they weren't exposed to a dead body, or they weren't exposed maybe to the volume. For us, it seems like week 1 or week 2, you're going to your first dead body. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, depending on how busy an agency you're with. Right.
Right. And so you experience it very quickly. Now, years and years ago, when Cele and I were younger, we did have
that must have been like 50 years ago.
Right. I think it was a dream. No, we did have a young intern. I won't go into the specifics, but she went with me to a death investigation. The body was out in the woods, and it was, for lack of better terms, a fresh body, meaning that, even with our Texas heat, there really was no smell. There was very minimal insect activity, things like that. So certainly decomposition was not a factor. And this intern did just fine until we got to the point of getting ready to roll the body over to photograph the backside. And she nearly fainted. And so then here we are calling EMS back to the scene, not for the victim, but for the intern. So, but in the grand scheme of things, like Cele and I have always talked about this, and Dan, same thing with you, of we would much rather a student go through, an internship and get a realistic impression, because TV does not do the job justice, unfortunately. And we hate to see a kid invest 3 or 4.5 years thinking that this is their lifelong dream, and then get to the first dead body and pass out or realize, oh, I don't like
that they physically can't do this.
Right. And so, it's unfortunate. And, I thank God every day that I landed in the field that I did. And, I didn't have really any significant prep for it either, because I think it's safe to say all 3 of us got into forensics before it was popular, before it was really talked about.
There weren't any shows about it. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, we didn't have that sparking our interest. I think it was, for all of us, it was just a natural interest of ours, and it just kind of fell into place. So,
well, and if I can expand on that too, so totally opposite example of what Leslie gave, but during Hurricane Rita, myself and Christine Ramirez went to a scene of a not fresh scene. It was two victims that had ultimately accidentally carbon monoxided. They died from carbon monoxide poisoning. But we had an intern with us, and she could not even make it to the front porch before she had to turn around and go back to our crime scene truck. And it was, Rita was at the end of summer. So in October, I believe, if I remember correctly. So she was well into her fall internship. And to my knowledge, she never pursued forensics. That was just that was the day that decided for her that this job was not for her. So, she wasn't a young intern like what Leslie had with her. She was, she I think was in probably her late 20s, early 30s. So, you try to say, well, maybe it's just the young kids, that are just fresh out of college. But it's the,
No, I really think it depends on the person. I really do.
Absolutely. I agree.
We've seen people that have finished out their careers and retired from the military and getting into law enforcement and forensic things later in their life. And I personally don't think that the young part matters as much as just the person themselves. Some people just really are bothered by it. And I don't know what that says about us, but, so.
We're not going to discuss that. That's another show.
Right. Exactly.
Probably has to be a psychologist on with us or something like that.
Right. We've always said we're a special case.
So what do you do with that though? Cele, in an example you're given, later in their internship, you have to finish that internship to get that degree, right? You can't really change course your last semester.
Right.
So we have safeguards in place at the lab that is the exact reason why, there's, luckily for us, we have a very large crime lab. And so, that would be a case where we would take that intern off of call rotation. They would then do more administrative duties like, assisting in our property room or, assisting with the administrative duties that we all get to do that TV never shows that we do. And so that's the kind of thing where, helping out in the lab with, observing, processing evidence. But when instances like that happen, unless, that intern comes back saying, hey, you know what, that was abnormal for me. I think I have a stomach bug, which it just negatively affected me. But as far as, kind of any kind of additional trauma, I didn't experience any of that. And I'm ready to go to the next scene, or sometimes it's a shock. And so
Sure.
Their first scene is very shocking, but then after they digest it and they get some sleep and they talk about it with one of us, then they're like, okay, I'm ready to go again. So, you really have to be careful, with
not to say that they're totally overwhelmed and not able to do this.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, I think everybody, when they first, again, what we see on a regular basis, people are not supposed to see, right? This is not something that is normal to be viewed on a regular basis. And so certainly your first time seeing a body that has been there so long, you can't even determine what race they are. And that's not normal, right? So just seeing that, I think taking that in doesn't mean you're not ready for it, but you may just need to calm down and go back through the motions. But it's good that y'all have something in place that if they've sort of recognized that about the self, they can still finish their degree and may end up sort of in the same situation as the writer of this question, that they finished realize that that's something that they can't do, and maybe there's another option for that degree.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
How many interns do y'all take on a regular basis?
We typically will have no more than 2 each semester. So we are generally interviewing for at least 1, if not 2 semesters beyond the current, barring the mode that we're in right now. Typically, I would be interviewing for the fall semester and potentially even the spring of 2021 at this point. But we try to limit it to 2 just so for multiple reasons. Number 1, space. So, you've seen our lab where we have limited real estate without the ability of expanding at the current point. So we don't want to overload too much. We try to keep it as fair as possible so that if we do have 2 interns, they have the ability to be exposed to as much as possible and have a pretty regular rotation. And also not to overburden the CSIs so that they are not distracted on scene. They're still able to teach and provide valuable information without compromising anything with the investigation.
So now, obviously, I looked for news articles, different issues facing law enforcement, and that sort of things that we talk about. And obviously, what has saturated the news right now is, of course, the virus and COVID-19 and how all of us are dealing with that. So, in talking about that, I know that y'all came up with a plan with y'all's lab and doing rotations. So under this current situation we're in, what are y'all doing different, or how are y'all doing rotations and stuff with people?
Cele, you want to handle that?
Sure.
Okay.
So, we really thought that that we were going to be cutting edge and we were forward thinking by splitting our lab in half and making essentially 2 teams, 1 team working from home, the other team working in the lab, handling call outs for the week. And then on the weekend, we would switch to the call out team would be at home for the week. And then the work at home team would come to work and handle the call outs. And then I had the opportunity to chat with my colleagues associated with the bloodstain community from around the world. And almost all crime scene teams have split their lab where there is no cross-contamination between teams in case one team would be exposed and have to quarantine or someone in that team would get sick. And so it was amazing. Even today, I was on a webcast, and in the chat bar, I recognized several people, and one of my friends from Grand Prairie, they are solely being called out from home. They're not going to the office at all unless it's to take their evidence in, drop it off, and leave. So because they have such a small crime scene team, they are not even chancing one of those people, passing it to a coworker. So they are strictly working from home, which I just think is phenomenal. In 22 years of being, at the sheriff's office, we've never done anything like this. And so when it came about, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, on the forward thinking. But then it makes me very proud that agencies from around the world are doing the same thing. My colleagues in Australia, my colleague in the UK, they're all doing split shifts where they're working from home for a week or 2 weeks, and then they're in the office for a week while the other teams are at home. So I just think that that's safe. I think that that's smart, because if we had an exposure and then the whole crime lab was exposed, if you have your entire crime scene team out for 14 days, who is going to work your biggest cases? Who do you call when everybody else is taxed?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same reason that we've sent pretty much all our detectives home. I mean, they can still type, they can still make the phone calls, they can do still things on their investigations. But and the main reason is not so much on the detective side; it's more on the patrol side. If we start getting patrol officers that are going out because they've become infected with the virus and they start going down, well, who's going to fill their spots?
Sure.
And that's where detectives are going to be coming from home and putting back on a uniform and getting back in the car and doing the patrol functions, because that is the backup plan, right?
Absolutely.
Now, the other impact, you're talking about Grand Prairie, so obviously, so they're taking their evidence there, but there's not a time that they're coming back processing any of this.
Correct. They're doing storage only, and they are telecommuting from their residence, and probably similar to us. So we are completely set up. Like, I have my desk, I've got my work computer, I've got a VPN token that I can patch into our county system. I have a scanner, I have a printer that are mine, but there were documents last week that I had to sign, and so I was able to print them out, sign them, scan them, and then email them back to the office and to our finance division, all right here from the house. I didn't have to go to the office. I didn't, so I never even had to go in the building even after hours, which keeps the team working there, right? I'm not bringing anything from my house and bringing it into the office, and then I'm not picking up anything that maybe they would have had at a scene and bringing it home. So everyone is doing so well at abiding by the rules, by sheltering in place, by work, and I just think it's really smart.
So how have the call-outs been? Have around, just looking at some of the news stories around the nation, it seems as though violent crimes and call-outs are down as a whole. Have y'all experienced the same?
I think initially it seemed like it peaked, or it increased. And I don't know that it was necessarily where we were overly aware or overly sensitive to it, but as far as the amount of scenes that our team responded to that first rotation, I would say it definitely increased from a normal week. Since then, knock on wood, I don't want to jinx us, but it seems like it has calmed down a little bit. I feel like we're kind of in a more normal mode right now, but we're all very well aware that the potential exists for it to spike and increase and continue to increase all the way through. And I think that's kind of everybody's fear, is that will happen.
Well, and I mean, it's just projecting. I mean, that I know I think it was just yesterday, I think they had like 3 robberies that I saw just in our county around it. And that's just what hit the news. That's not just like our department or whatever.
Right.
And I think we're sort of expecting that, just because as time goes on and people are out of jobs, they don't have money. Don't get me wrong, there's a majority of the citizens that are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And they're surviving the best they can, and they're, getting the services that people are offering. But there's also that small percentage that when they don't get what they need, they turn to crime.
Right.
And I think that we're probably going to see an increase in robberies and thefts and those type of things. And hopefully not so much to the violent side, that, it's more shoplifting and those type of things. But I think the potential is certainly there.
I agree. And I think that's kind of what we're anticipating, or we're geared up for. Not that we want it to happen. Obviously we don't. But we're prepared for that.
So what has, so I know that whenever this first hit, all of us were facing the lack of PPE equipment to get to patrol, to give to everybody. And, it also made me sort of just think in general as far as crime scene and such, and I'm not sure if it's just because we see it in a news story or what, but normally when I see agencies in other parts of the world, it seems like they're wearing this full Tyvek suit everywhere they go, right? And then I see here that we have gloves, mask, and I don't mean the virus. I mean just before all the virus, right? It doesn't seem like we suit up like that on everything. And what do you think the difference is?
Cele?
I think it's, for us, it's a health safety issue. Those bunny suits or the Tyvek suits, so the full white hazmat suit, those by OSHA standards are good for 15 minutes. You are supposed to only be in that suit, worn correctly, with it zipped up, with the hood on, with the mask on. You are only supposed to be in that suit for 15 minutes before you're supposed to come out of that suit and rehydrate. And, it takes, an hour just to take your overall scene, photographs on a big scene where you would be in that suit to begin with. And so it is safer for you to have shoe covers, gloves, a mask, possibly a face shield or some kind of goggles than it is to be in a full Tyvek suit, because you run the risk of dehydrating and getting heat stroke.
And that's not even considering the fact of where we're talking about, where it stays 100% humidity and asphalt turns to a liquid state in the summertime. So,
right.
But so, I mean, are they actually wearing it for the full scene work in other countries? Is it just, that's just what it's portrayed as? Do you know people that you spoke with?
Sure. So that's all going to be by SOP on what your scene response is going to, how you are going to process crime scenes. In places, my home state of Wyoming, wearing a Tyvek suit might actually be perfect because you have winter up there for 9 months out of the year. So that suit does provide warmth, because it holds all your body heat in. And so in places where you don't have the surface temperature of the sun most of the year,
right,
it's a lot easier to wear those suits to every single crime scene, as opposed to those of us that work in southern states where it's dangerous. Now, there are times where, you will deal with the potential of getting heat stroke, because the thought of having to burn your boots and your uniform when you finish processing the scene, it's like, I'm willing to...
You're about to lay down in that stuff, yeah.
Yep.
Right.
And you just know that, you've got to send one of your deputies, or your patrol officers to the store to get several bottles of Gatorade, because, you're going to have to sit there and rehydrate. And so for us, it is a scene investigator call. It's not mandated by policy. It's really the CSI's discretion.
So with all of the patrol now having to wear masks and gloves, and obviously I would hope that patrol already had gloves, that they're already wearing these things on a regular basis. So I would think we would have had enough for that. I think masks are something that they didn't have. It's not something normally that we're wearing. I know that I've seen a change as this has gone on. I know originally it was you don't need the mask. Then it was only if you felt you were coming into a situation where it was probable. Now some agencies are saying you wear a mask on everything. Some aren't. I know that we've had, at least in Texas for the emergency center, I know that we have different emergency operations that happen around the country, and they all work under the same standard. I know in Texas we had an order for like 5 million of these masks to go out to first responders, and now there's a company that's making like 2 million a week to come out. So I think that we're starting to get the supplies now. I know that we had to make our own for a little bit. So somewhat of a funny story on that is, we couldn't find hand sanitizer. A local pharmacy down here, which put out a video because you couldn't find the alcohol in the stores to mix and things. So anyway, so we got a recipe for Everclear and some other items, and that was Magnolia Pharmacy that put that out. So anybody that still needs some, that can't find some, they can make that. But it was I don't know if you understand this, but when you go into a liquor store with the county credit card, it gets declined. So we had to get that cleared so we could buy alcohol with our county credit card to mix the stuff up. So I know that y'all have had to come up with things too to get stuff out there in the lab and all. It's just something that we're dealing with. I know currently, I guess we're expecting May to sort of do an evaluation, but I think honestly we're probably looking at about 2 more months of really being cautious and everything with this. And do you feel that we should or are handling crime scenes any different than we were before?
I think we absolutely have to at least have a more heightened awareness and caution in dealing with them. I think there are times where we can use a little bit more discretion on, how many people we choose to have respond or in what capacity. There's things we can be a little bit more selective on without compromising any investigation aspect of it. But certainly just the potential for any witnesses to have been exposed or to be sick themselves. Certainly if it's a DOA, the potential for that and the environment in which we're going into. I know we've already had some death investigations where the particular residents might have been on the radar for one thing or another, in consideration for COVID. And so EMS would either restrict the amount of patrol officers that made entry into the scene, or they would take the patrolman's camera and take photographs for the patrolman to keep them out of the scene so that there was less potential for them to be exposed. So I think there's precautions like that. Like you mentioned, the PPE. We're probably, I would assume, or go out on a limb and say that we are wearing more PPE currently than we would maybe go, like Cele said, it's the CSI discretion. But now we are telling all of our CSIs, make sure you have your PPEs on.
Right. I mean, the standard going into any crime scene, I mean, we've always had our gloves and throw on some booties. And I think one of the, I guess, options or things that sometimes I'd see people wear, didn't on others, was mask. I'm sure that's that's on every time now. I know as DNA, it became more sensitive. It became more common that we always had it on also. So, I think, as you said, I think it's just more being aware that there's potential for the virus and exposure and things that, I mean, we're always wearing it to protect our evidence, to protect us. But now I think it just goes beyond for more safety reasons.
I think so. Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad that there's more awareness with it too.
Thank you for joining us today. It's because of listeners like you that make this show a success. This show is currently on every major podcast and listened to in 13 countries around the world, along with here local at our Lone Star Radio in Conroe, Texas on FM 104.5 and 106.1. If you have a question that you would like answered, if you'd like to be a guest, or if you'd like to sponsor the show, please contact me at dan@crimescenetoday.com. We look forward to seeing you next week. Be safe.